introduction, and it's a real honor to be here to give this Heinz lecture, and I mean that sincerely. I have a copy of The Ecology of Running Waters on my bookshelf, and this was one of the first books I bought when I first entered graduate school, and it was one of my Bibles, really. I think the other Bible that I had as a graduate student was Rosemary Loeb McConnell's The Community Ecology of Fishes in Tropical Fresh Waters, which probably led me to this career path somewhat. So those were two very influential books for me. So this is truly an honor, and I'm grateful to the Institute for inviting me. And I'm going to talk about different parts of the world today, a little different from New Brunswick, Canada. I brought some warm tropical weather with me here. So it's been very pleasant for me. And what I'm going to try to do with this talk is give you just some idea of the diversity of fishes that you find in the tropical regions, a little bit about their adaptations. I'll mention convergent evolution, which I think is a remarkable feature of tropical fishes, and then finish up talking about some of the current threats faced by these remarkable organisms. So first off, I feel very fortunate to be able to conduct some of our research in the tropical regions of the world. There's some very, very beautiful rivers. We have beautiful rivers in North America, but some of the ones in the tropics are just really unusual and very beautiful. So this is Guyana. This is a Blackwater River in a forested region in the very south of Brazil, south of Venezuela, near the Brazilian border. This is another Blackwater River up close in southern Venezuela, a tributary of the Cassiquiare, the river that connects the headwaters of the Orinoco to the Amazon. This is a Blackwater stream in Brazil, viewed up close. That water's just mystifying, that color. This is a Clearwater River that drains the Brazilian Shield region in South America, the Xingu. I'll talk about the Xingu at the very end of the talk. A Clearwater River in karstic region in Chiapas, southern Mexico. A river in Cambodia. If you've ever seen the movie Apocalypse Now, supposedly where he was going upriver to find the colonel was supposed to be this river. I think it was pretty fictitious, but it doesn't look like the movie. And then here's a river in West Africa. And that haze you see in the background is the harmattan, the dust of the Sahara that blows up in the dry season. So very dusty during that time of year. And a stream in Cameroon, Central Africa. So when you think of tropical freshwater fish, I think for most people, you think of aquarium fish, these colorful little fish that you see in the pet shop. And actually that's one of the things that got me hooked on biology as a kid, was keeping an aquarium with these colorful little fish. And there is a lot of diversity in the tropics that are the smaller species for sure. Beautiful fish like angelfish, very familiar to the ornamental fish hobby. But also much larger species as well inhabit the rivers and streams of the tropics. These peacock bass are popular sport fish, very beautiful in their own right. And you find very unusual fishes, including the catfishes. To me, anywhere in the tropics, Africa, Asia, South America, the catfishes have just evolved into the most unusual shapes, colors, ecological niches, quite remarkable. This is a predatory catfish in South America, so-called sorbim. And the red-tailed catfish. This catfish has a very hard, bony head, very thick skull, and even the inside of its mouth is very bony. And one of the best ways to catch them is fishing at night using piranha as bait. I think they may actually have a preference for piranhas. And maybe they have that bony mouth, this is speculation, to be able to slurp in the sleeping piranhas at night and then instantly crush them between their tongue and the roof of their mouth. And African lungfish, very, very unusual lineage of fish, air-breathing fish, distant relative to the tetrapod vertebrates. So in the tropics, we're still discovering new species all the time. In fact, there aren't enough ichthyologists to keep pace with all the new species that are being collected in the tropics. And particularly in South America, every year, lots of new species are described. And it was estimated in a recent publication, on average, about 240 new fish species described, on average, every year. And most of these are coming out of the tropical freshwater ecosystems. So these are the pike cichlids from South America. And most people would be surprised to hear this, but if you're familiar with the plecos, the so-called plecostomus, algae eaters that they sell in pet shops to clean the algae off the glass of your aquarium, this is perhaps the most species-rich vertebrate family on Earth, is this family of the Loricariidae, these armored sucker-mouth catfish. And lots of new species are described every year out of this family, and a lot remain to be described. We just don't have enough taxonomists to keep pace with the material that's coming in. And most people think of these plecostomus, these pleco fish, as algae eaters, and many of them indeed are algae feeders, but probably more of them actually feed on detritus, inorganic particulate matter that collects on the bottom of the stream. But not all of them are algivorous or detritivorous. The two on the bottom have these strange teeth, and actually very few teeth compared to the ones that scrape algae off of surfaces. And these actually consume a fair amount of macroinvertebrates. So apparently they're using these teeth to pry aquatic insect larvae and other macroinvertebrates out of cracks and things. We're not exactly sure how they do it. This is a figure from a study that a postdoc that was in my lab, Nathan Lujan, and I published a few years ago, where we were trying to characterize the trophic diversity of the loricariids using stable isotope data. So stable isotopes can sometimes reflect the resources that are consumed by organisms. And so the green and red arrows is just a vector method to show the differentiation of these species in isotopic space. And then there's a phylogeny that they're mapped on. But notice the shape of the oral disc and the lips and the barbels and the teeth. Extremely varied in their morphology, and that reflects their varied ecology. And this is a diagram also from Nathan Lujan that he prepared to show the convergence in fishes on different continents from the Amazon, the Mekong, and the Congo River on the bottom of fishes that live in rapids. They're benthic fishes that live in very rapidly flowing water. And we see a convergence in body form, even mouth form, and overall ecology of these species that's quite remarkable. So this is just one example of convergent evolution that you find among freshwater tropical fishes. Virtually anywhere in the world you go that has any substantial amount of fish diversity, you're going to find little fish that look like this, that live on the bottom and feed on macroinvertebrates. Here in North America, these are the darters in the perch family, the Percidae. But in Africa, Asia, South America, even Europe, you've got little fish that look very similar and basically make their living in the very same way. So this is evolutionary convergence because these species come from very divergent families. They're not closely related, and yet they've converged on similar morphology and a similar ecological niche. And one of my favorite examples of convergent evolution are these fish. The fish on the top is a carassiform fish, the order Carassiformes, from South America. The one on the bottom is a cypriniform fish, the order that contains the carps and the minnows, from Asia. Now, this is not a generalized fish morphology. This body plan is a very specialized morphology that's designed for the fish to swim in the water column and capture prey. These are piscivores. They feed on fish. And they have these big wing-like pectoral fins that they use to get upward thrust. And they have a keeled ventral region, anterior ventral region, that's very narrow and keeled. And that's for muscle attachments. And what they do is they swim around, and when they see prey, they get under it, and then they push those big pectoral fins down and come up, and the jaws open and then snap shut on the fish. But there's one big difference in their morphology. So most of the cyprinid fishes, well, all the cyprinids lacked oral jaw teeth, okay? So it has no teeth, whereas the carassiforms have very substantial teeth. So that's one difference where they're not the same, but to me this is remarkable that you could evolve this body plan so specialized and this way of feeding on prey independently in two different lineages. And perhaps even more remarkable are the weakly electric fishes. These are fishes that generate an electric field. They have modified muscle cells that are now electrogenic organs in their skin that produce an electric field around their body, and these electric fields vary in their attributes, the wavelengths and frequencies and so on. And they use it to navigate at night, the same way that bats use radar. They're using electricity the way bats use sonar. And they also use it to communicate. They use it to talk to each other the way that birds sing. And in some species, they're sexually dimorphic. The males will have a different frequency than females. And this has evolved twice independently. In the African mormyrids on the left, and in the South American gymnotiforms on the right. And not just the ability to generate and perceive electrical fields, but also in the morphology of their head shape, their mouth position, and their trophic niche, their feeding ecology. You can find convergent pairs, including these tube-snouted species like you see on the top there. Very specialized morphology for feeding on macroinvertebrates that are hidden in cracks and crevices. Now I want to mention the role of fishes in their ecosystems. And they're obviously very ecologically diverse, but many of them have been demonstrated to influence ecological dynamics in rivers and streams. These fruit-eating fishes in South America, and there are a variety of fruit-eating fishes, not just this tambaqui that you see here, which is a member of the piranha family, but it's an herbivorous fish that enters the flooded forest and feeds on fruits and seeds. But also there are a number of catfish species and some other groups of fish that also feed on fruit. And we see fruit-eating fish also in Southeast Asia and Africa. And there's even accounts of fruit eating by channel catfish in North America. So it occurs even in our North American fish fauna. But it's very specialized in the tropics. And it was hypothesized years ago that perhaps these fish could even be effective seed dispersers in the rainforest in the riparian zone of the Amazon River. And there's been some recent studies that have actually demonstrated certain tree species seeds will germinate more effectively after they've passed through the gut of a tambaqui. So maybe it is the case that they're significant seed dispersers. It's not just birds and monkeys, it's also fish. And then we've got fish that are benthic feeders, detritivores, like some of those loricariid catfishes that I mentioned, the plecos. But a very important group in South America are the procylodontids. This one is Semiprocylodus neri. And we conducted studies in Venezuela several years ago and did field experiments where we were able to demonstrate this fish has a very significant effect on the benthic ecology of the river. They remove so much organic material off the bottom of the river. They're basically cleaning the bottom of the river. And we conducted experiments using fish exclosures and enclosures. This is just an example of tiles that we put inside our cages. And what happens when you exclude these benthic feeding fish, the TFE and the LFE is where the fish were excluded, you very quickly get a buildup of organic matter on the bottom of the river. And so in the dry season, when these fish are really abundant, this is what this river looks like. It's a beautiful place to work because the water's clean, and even the bottom of the river is clean. It's just clean sand. And now we believe the reason it looks like that is because of the action of these fish. They're very abundant, and they're just cleaning the river bottom. And of course, predatory species. This is a catfish from the Mekong Basin, Belodontichthyes. I like this photo because it reminds me of a dragon or something. You wouldn't think that was a catfish, right? It doesn't look like our North American ones. The African tigerfish, that's my little rooster tail lure that I somehow miraculously was able to catch this thing without breaking the line. And another really interesting head morphology is the Payata hydraulicus. They've got these saber-toothed tiger-like canine teeth, but they're on the lower jaw. And they use that to impale their prey. They have the big wing-like pectoral fins like the other fish I showed you, and they're in fact related to that one. But they stab their prey. The jaw drops down, they thrust upward, and they stab. And the really cool thing is they have holes in the top of their skull so that they can close their mouth. So they slide up inside those holes. Now, whenever I teach my undergrad ecology class at A&M, I talk a lot about fish because that's what I do. And they always ask me about this river monster guy. I get this all the time. And I'm like, this guy is a fraud. He says he's a biologist, but I can't find any documentation of that. But I think the show's really cool, actually. I watch it because I think it's interesting, the places he goes. But it's also kind of annoying because he's afraid of everything. I mean, it's too much. So I tell my students that I'm the actual river monster guy. Okay. And piranhas. When you talk about predatory fish in the tropics with nasty sharp teeth, everybody wants to know about piranhas. And yes, they are dangerous in that if you handle them and you're not careful, they could take a big chunk out of you. I mean, those jaws are very powerful. But they're not as dangerous as the river monster guy would have you believe. Like he got in a swimming pool with a bunch of little baby ones and he was scared. I mean, they're not going to hurt you. We get in the water all the time and they're around and nobody's been bitten yet. But what most people don't realize is the piranha is a very, very diverse group. So there's all kinds of different piranha species. And they come in all shapes and sizes, and some of them feed on different things. So the Ceratosaurus elongatus feeds on fish fins. They very rarely get any of the meat, the flesh. They're fin nippers. That's all that they eat, basically. Here's a piranha called the wimple piranha, Cataprion. It's a scale feeder. Look at that lower jaw. It's got this big lower jaw. That lower jaw drops down, and it uses it to rake across the flanks of other fish, and it peels the scales off like you would remove shingles off of a roof. And then it eats scales. It's a scale eater, scale-eating piranha. Now, this is a fish that kind of creeps me out. It's, some people call it a whale catfish. Cetopsis, it's in the family Cetopsidae. The people in Brazil call it candiru, but candiru is kind of a catch-all term. I'll show you another example in a moment. But this is a carrion feeder. These are the vultures of the Amazon. They're also in the Orinoco River. They're almost blind. They have these little tiny eyes that are actually covered with skin. So they look like they're blind. But they're actually, they must have an incredible sense of smell, because if you're bait fishing, these are usually the first things to show up. And you don't have to wait long if they're around. They are right on it. So these are the vultures of the river. They clean up dead stuff. But they're very slimy. They look weird. They're very strange. I mean, look at that face. That's just, it's disturbing. And they have these teeth. They're small, but they're all in a row, and they actually can clip out flesh just like piranhas do. They're flesh eaters. There's also, speaking of dangerous fish, river monsters, the electric eel. This is the only gymnotiform that can generate enough of an electrical field to actually produce a shock, enough voltage and amperage to actually shock you. And it's a very powerful shock. I mean, it can knock out and incapacitate a full-grown human being easily. There's also an electric catfish in Africa. It used to be considered a single species, but it's a few years ago been split up, and there's actually 4 or 5 different species of electric catfish, which also generates a pretty powerful electrical shock. You wouldn't want to pick one of these things up, I'll put it that way. And then this is the really scary candiru. So this is one fish that you ought to be afraid of in South America, in the Amazon. This is the candiru that's a little tiny catfish. Some of them are really, really tiny, that feeds on blood of other fish. They enter the gill chamber of other fish, they get in there, they hook on, and they chew on the blood-rich gill filaments, and that's how they make their living. They're little vampires. And I see some of you giggling already because you know what's coming, you know the story. At first it was a legend, or at least biologists thought it was a legend, that local people reported that occasionally these would enter the urethra of swimmers who were in the water and urinating. And for a long time, we just thought that was an urban legend. Turns out there are documented cases of this, so it really can happen. So if you're ever down in the Amazon and you're in the water, don't pee in the water, okay? Not a good idea. That would not be good. And this is another Ray Troll artwork that I love. The moment of realization when the candiru hits. This is another type of candiru, a fish in the family Trichomicteridae, the same family as the little vampire catfish. But this one doesn't feed on blood, it feeds on mucus slime. And that's all that they eat. They attach to other fish. Most fish have a protective slime layer. And they graze on that. They just go along, they have this little sucker-like mouth, and they rasp along, and they feed on mucus. And I guess mucus must be pretty nutritious, because I actually did a study, one of my earliest studies, and I looked at like 300 stomachs of this little catfish, and all I ever found was rolled up wads of mucus. And people have observed them in tanks, and that's in fact what they do. Here's another little Trichomicterid catfish, this same family. that I discovered by accident. We were on an expedition in southern Venezuela, and I was trying to catch a little tetra or something with the dip net, and I took a swipe, and I missed the fish I was after, and I got a net full of sand. And so I dumped the sand out on the ground so I could try again, and I noticed little things wiggling in there. And at first I thought they were worms, and they were tiny. And so I looked closer, and I realized they were little catfish. So I collected some and preserved them, and I eventually sent them to the taxonomic expert for the group. And I said, can you tell me if these are juveniles or adults? And he studied them, and he said, these are adult fish. These are grown-up fish. And they were almost microscopic. So they were living buried in the sand like worms, like little nematodes or something, you know, like soil fauna almost. And it turned out to be a new species that we described together. There's only 2 species known in this genus now. And then with all these predatory fish, these nasty things with teeth, fish need ways to defend themselves in the tropics. And there are a whole host of adaptations for that that we don't have time to explore this evening. But really remarkable is some of the mimicry that you find in the tropics. These fish, that's a leaf fish on the left and a type of catfish, Aspidinidae is the family on the right, that mimic dead leaves or pieces of detritus in the case of the catfish. And these fish are very slow moving, right? These catfish, these Bunocephalus, when you keep them in aquariums, they almost don't do anything. They just sit there on the bottom all day long doing nothing. And so that's very good to mimic a leaf, but how do they get enough nutrition to sustain themselves? Well, for one thing, they're not using up much energy because they're not swimming around doing anything. So they probably have a very low activity level and a low food intake rate, but very low energy expenditure. And it works for them. Many of the catfishes have very impressive spines, pectoral and dorsal spines, that basically make their diameter effectively much larger, and that deters predators. Some catfish have venom in their spines. And speaking of spines with venom, the freshwater stingrays in South America are actually one of the more dangerous fishes that you want to look out for. It's apparently no joke to be hit by one of these things. I actually had one of my students just barely got pricked on the ankle by one of these things, and it must have been a very small one. I mean, you could barely even tell that it broke the skin, and he was in incredible pain. It was horrible to see the way this guy suffered, but he's okay. Okay, so now, when most people think about endangered species, probably not the folks in this room, because we have a lot of people from the Canadian River Institute, but probably most people think about birds and mammals and things like that. But it turns out that freshwater fish are among the most threatened organisms on the planet. And actually, I would say currently our understanding of the levels of threat, it's greatest in places like China, North America, and Europe, because we've done a pretty good job documenting the status of wildlife and fishery populations. But the threats are increasing in the tropics, and that's what I want to talk about next. And there's a lot more at stake in the tropics, frankly, because of the huge biodiversity that exists there, and also the fact that people really depend on inland fisheries for their livelihoods and for food security. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So what are the threats? I got this picture off the internet. I didn't take it myself, but this is the Ganges River somewhere in India. I mean, that's like horrible, right? That's like as bad as it gets with pollution. But this is a growing problem in the tropical area. Now here's a river in Peru. This is the Tambopata River in southern Peru. It's part of the Amazon basin. What I'm holding up there is this strange little catfish that lives in this muddy river that drains out of the Andes Mountains. And that's the length of its barbel. You know, the whiskers on the catfish? I mean, it's like 4 times as long as the fish is. It's incredibly long barbels. It's a weird little fish. But this river is in a protected area where there's some ecotourism going on that is benefiting the local communities. And you find some strange fish like this Platystomatichthys. But what's happening today is illegal gold mining in the headwaters of the Rio Tambopata. So this is an aerial photo. I also got this one off of the internet. But they're turning huge regions into what looks like a moonscape. What was primary, undisturbed tropical rainforest is converted into this just expanse of mud, pits and mud, because people are after gold, okay? But it's polluting the river with sediment and also with mercury, because the way they extract the gold from the sediments that they dredge up is to use mercury. There's a technique where they cook it over a propane flame and mix it with mercury, and it amalgamates, and they can separate out the gold. And mercury is readily available in the markets and in the local towns. And it's getting into the water, and it's getting into the biota. So we did this study and looked at the fish and the biomagnification of mercury up the food chain. And there were some dangerous levels in some of the larger catfish, the very species that people are eating. So not good. Threat number 2, land change, which is obviously occurring in the upper Tambopata, but it's occurring in many regions of the tropics, including the Amazon. So in this image, the yellow are areas that have been deforested. So everything you see in yellow used to be forest, and now it's not. In some areas, a big problem is oil palm plantations. You've probably heard about this issue. You would be probably shocked to see the variety of products that we use that have oil from oil palm in it. You can hardly buy anything at the supermarket that doesn't have oil from oil palm. So it's a big growing industry worldwide, and it's causing a lot of deforestation in places like Borneo, Malaysia, and now the Amazon. And I have a PhD student, Carol Arantes. She's from Brazil. She actually just defended her doctoral dissertation a week ago. She did a tremendous study in the Amazon, surveying fish assemblages and studying the food web in the floodplain of the lower Amazon. And an issue she was really interested in was the relationship between forest cover and fish abundance and fish diversity. That was her main focus. So this is one of her results, where we've got forest cover from low to high on the x-axis, and then we've got the abundance, the correlation of abundance of fishes with forest cover. And you see a lot of these relationships are going upward. So that's telling us that for those particular functional groups of fishes where the slope is upward, you tend to have more abundance where you have more forest cover in the landscape. And this is a picture. I have to give Carol credit. So this is Carol. She's very short. So I say she's the smallest biologist, and she studies some of the largest fish species in the world. She actually did her master's thesis work in Brazil on the arapaima, the fish that you see here. And yeah, that was the work she did before she came to A&M. Threat number 3, overfishing. This is a huge impact in tropical regions. I told you people depend on inland fisheries. hugely important, you know, much more important than here in North America. I mean, we like to catch fish from our rivers and streams, mainly because it's fun. I mean, they're good to eat, but like if we didn't have those fish to eat, most of us would be okay. That's not the case in many tropical regions. That's a picture I took in Mali in West Africa. Usually they dry the fish, they smoke it or dry it and sell it that way. So as I mentioned, many regions in developing tropical countries are hugely dependent on their inland fisheries, mostly from large floodplain rivers. This is a figure from a recent paper by our colleague Peter McIntyre at the University of Wisconsin and others. So on the x-axis is the per capita GDP of various countries. On the y-axis is an index of the fish catch of those countries, of inland fish, freshwater fish. The size of the bubbles is the amount of protein intake that is freshwater fish. So the bigger the circle, the more freshwater fish they're consuming in that country on average. And then the darkness of the circles indicates the extent that people under the age of 12 are underweight. So the dark circles, you have more kids underweight that are less well nourished. And you see that the big circles and the dark circles are to the left. So these are poor countries. And they're eating a lot of fish. So the circles at the top are also some of the poorer countries. So this just illustrates what I've been telling you about the importance of these fisheries. But the problem that we're seeing is the fishing effort is too intense in most regions. There's too much harvest, and it's influencing the composition of the fish assemblages in these rivers. It's having an impact. So this is the very familiar fishing down phenomenon. Not necessarily fishing down in trophic levels, because I'm not sure that happens in a strict sense in the tropical freshwaters, but you're definitely fishing down body size. The most valuable species are the large ones. And so those get eliminated first. They may not go extinct, but they become functionally extinct. They become economically extinct. And then you have to go to smaller and smaller stocks. So this is a problem that I've seen all over in the tropics. Here's an example from Cambodia, the Tonle Sap River, which is a river that drains a huge shallow lake in the center of the country. And then it drains into the Mekong River mainstem. And it's a very productive fishery, but they're not catching big fish like that giant Mekong catfish anymore. They're harvesting much, much smaller fish. The fishery's dominated by small, fast-growing, short-lived species. And here's an example of they use all kinds of fishing practices, but this is one that's pretty amazing. It's called the Dai fishery, D-A-I. And they put these huge bag-like nets that are stationary in the Tonle Sap River. And the fish are migrating downstream during this time of the year. And so they just run right into the bag. And then they periodically lift it up and dump out all the fish and put it out again. And sometimes they line them up like you see here to block off, you know, a section of the river and kind of force the fish to go into one of the bags. So it's a very effective fishing method, obviously, but potentially very destructive, right? Because you're catching so much. You have to let some fish escape, right? So this is not really very sustainable. This is another shot of a different method called a barrage fishery, where they basically put a wooden fence across the river, and they leave gaps in the fence, and then they have scaffolding behind the gaps, and they line the scaffolding with netting, and the fish have to run through those gaps, and they run right into these troughs of nets, and then they can just pick it up and take everything. This has actually been outlawed now in Cambodia. Thank goodness, because the first time I saw this, I couldn't believe my eyes. I'm like, there's no way this can be sustainable. You're taking everything out of the river. You have to leave something in there. And a lot of the fish in Southeast Asia are sold fresh, but some are dried. The smaller species are sold dried, and it keeps that way. And some are turned into fish paste. So this is the Tres Riel. There's actually two species of, we would call these minnows in North America. They're just small fish. They're actually detritivores. They're very, very abundant. They're probably more abundant today than they were historically because the big fish that ate them are very rare now. And so there's huge harvest of Tres Riel, and they turn much of it into prahok, fish paste, and eat it that way. Okay, so you're probably sitting there thinking, this is horrible. What do we do about this? Well, I'm not sure we can fix all this problem. A lot of it is, social problem, political problem, what have you. But community-based management seems to be one solution for effective fisheries management in the tropics. If you can have an area under local control where the people know that they have control of that resource, and if they can come together as a community and decide on some management measures to sustain the fishery, it's been shown that that can be effective in the tropics. Also, freshwater reserves. This hasn't really been explored to a great extent in tropical freshwaters, but the idea has been mentioned, and it needs to be looked into. And then ultimately, a lot of people are going to have to turn to alternative livelihoods. There's just too many people, and there's not enough fish, and there's not enough habitat to sustain these levels of fish harvest. It's just not going to be tenable in the future. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, many of these developing tropical countries also have very high birth rates, and their populations are growing at a fairly rapid rate compared to Canada or the US. So that's a problem as well. Okay, threat number 4, and the last one I'm going to talk about because I don't want to depress you too much. But this is actually a big one, and this is one I've been working on lately. Some of our research has been directed at this problem. So this is actually the Belo Monte hydroelectric complex. I took this photo myself about 3 years ago while it was under construction. This is on the Xingu River in the Brazilian Amazon. We published this paper a couple of years ago in Science where we wanted to draw attention to this problem. In the Amazon, the Congo, and the Mekong, especially the Mekong and the Amazon, there's a lot of new dams under construction, major hydroelectric dams on major rivers, and a lot more planned. So some of those dots are the planned hydroelectric projects, some are the ones that are either existing or under construction at that time. And most of you are probably well aware that dams have a whole variety of environmental impacts. In fact, I'm fond of telling anybody who wants to hear that if you want to destroy a river, probably the best way to achieve that is put a big dam on it. I really mean that. There's so many impacts. You cut off the ability for organisms to migrate longitudinally. You alter the flow regime downstream. In addition, you block sediment dynamics downstream. You block the delivery of sediments, which is essential in rivers. You block the delivery of nutrients. You upset the nutrient dynamics. It can extend, those effects can extend all the way to the estuary, to the ocean. So this is a big problem in the tropics where we have all this biodiversity. it's a problem everywhere, but all this biodiversity that I've described a little bit to you this evening is at risk. This is an interesting phenomenon that was only discovered about 15 years ago. There are at least 2 species of very large catfish in the Amazon. There's one of them, the dorada, that apparently undergo migrations that are the entire length of the Amazon River. And the Amazon River is the largest river on the planet, right? So this is a remarkable migration, animal migration. I mean, that ranks up there with, wildebeest and, the terns and other organisms. But it appears that they spawn in the foothills of the Andes. They go up to the headwaters to spawn. Not the very headwaters, but the Piedmont region. And then the eggs and larvae drift the length of the Amazon, and they end up as juveniles in the mouth of the Amazon, in that delta region. And that's really the only place you find the juveniles. And then they remain there for 2, 3, several years. And there's actually a commercial fishery in the mouth of the Amazon for these catfish, and they're all immature fish. And then they apparently mature and work their way back upriver, and when they're in spawning condition, go to the headwaters again. Amazing. Imagine what a big hydroelectric dam does when you block the migration route. You lose that stock. The Mekong River, very important river in Southeast Asia. It's got over 1,000 fish species, many endemic only to that basin, very rich in fish diversity. I told you, very important inland fisheries in the Mekong Basin, particularly in Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. And about 65 million people live in that basin, and many of them rely on freshwater fish as their main source of animal protein in their diet. I'll just show you a few pictures of oddball fish from the Mekong. This is a large carp in Sisolabio. It has this weird indentation on its forehead, and I have no idea what that serves for, but it's weird. A large predatory catfish, Walago. This is my former doctoral student, Chuli U. She's from Cambodia. She did her dissertation research there. You have loaches, eels, freshwater eels, spiny eels, giant gourami, air-breathing fish, giant snakehead. That's Carmen Montana, another former doctoral student. She's from Venezuela, but she helped out on some of the field work over there. And the feather fins, primitive family. They kind of look like some of the knife fish that you find in South America that are weakly electric. They have the same body shape, but these fish cannot generate electric fields, so they're not convergent in that regard. So Chuli did a field project on food web ecology on 4 rivers in northeastern Cambodia, the Mekong itself, and 3 major tributaries. They call them the 3 S rivers, the Sekong, the Shreypak, and the Sesan. And we surveyed in the dry season and in the wet season, when the water was low and when the water was high. And we collected samples to analyze for stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen. And I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I know some of you are well versed in that, and probably some of you are not. But it's a way that we can look at food web structure and infer some things about the trophic ecology of the fishes and the rivers. And the first thing we noticed is there was something different about the Sesan. And when we went and stayed at local villages and got help from the locals, they told us that the river had changed. And the river changed when the dams went in upstream in the headwaters in Vietnam. And after that, the river didn't flood as much, and it sort of filled in with sand. All the deep pools just kind of filled in with sand, and it became kind of a uniform river bottom. And it had less species than the other rivers. And here's a plot of the stable isotope results. And I just want to point out that, and this is for the Shriepak, that what we found in all four rivers is that it looks like riparian vegetation is fueling the aquatic food web largely during the wet season. And we could try to estimate this quantitatively with models. But the gist of it is wet season, riparian vegetation, dry season, algae primarily. So what happens is the rivers get very muddy in the wet season with sediment, suspended sediment. There's little light penetration, not good conditions for algal growth. And in the dry season, the sediments drop out of the water column, the water clears up, and you start to get some phytoplankton and benthic algae production. Well, we found that the Saison River, the one with the dams upstream, was a little different than the others. It didn't show as distinctive of a separation of wet season and dry season. And so we think that this is the influence of the dams disrupting the normal seasonal hydrology of the river. I'm going to end with the Xingu River quickly. This is the river where I showed you the dam that was being constructed. It's now completed. It's a beautiful, beautiful river. It has slower flowing stretches, and then it's got stretches of rapids, like I showed you in an earlier slide. It's one of the most beautiful rivers that I've ever seen. The water's clear. You've got all these rapids. It's a mosaic of channels and rapids and rocks, and it's very diverse. It's got a lot of endemism. There are a lot of species that occur nowhere else in the Amazon basin. They're only in the Xingu River. And the Xingu River flows right into the Amazon. So you might be wondering, well, why don't the fish just distribute themselves all throughout the basin? Well, they don't. They're apparently adapted to this kind of riverine habitat with lots of rapids and rocks and so on. So this is an endemic species of peacock bass, Cichla melani, that only occurs in the Xingu, nowhere else. This is a pike characin, kind of convergent with the northern pike, but it's a completely different order of fish. This is a weird little anastomid fish that has these teeth on the lower jaw that it apparently uses to pry off sponges from the underside of rocks. They feed on freshwater sponges. This is a relative of the piranhas. It's actually a type of piranha, but it's not a carnivore, it's an herbivore. They feed on aquatic macrophytes that are anchored to the rocks in the rapids. You only catch them in the rapids in very, very fast water. And it has this weird shaped mouth to be able to feed off the rocks. It's a piranha, basically. And it has teeth that have a different morphology than the carnivorous piranhas. They're more spatula-like. Little catfish. I'm just going to quickly show you some of the loricariids. There's a lot of endemic loricariids in the Xingu. And some of them are really interesting in their coloration, their morphology. They actually have quite a bit of trophic diversity. I had a graduate student who recently completed, who worked with our team on the Xingu and examined the ecological diversity of the fishes. And the loricariids were just amazingly diverse. Some of these pictures I'm showing you are undescribed species. They don't have names yet. Some of them are very popular. That's the male on the right, the female on the left. The males grow these spiky things on their head. I guess they use it in combat with other males. There's a shot of the male from below. You can see that oral disc with papillae on it. This fish is very expensive in the aquarium hobby. It's called a zebra plico. In Germany, people will pay like $200 for one of these things. And they only come from the rapids zone of the lower Xingu. That's the only place on Earth where they occur. So there's an ornamental fishery, a fishery to capture ornamental fish for export for the aquarium hobby that's centered in this region of rapids on the lower Xingu. So just all kinds of these crazy loricariids, these so-called plecostomus. All these are different species, and there's more. I'm just showing you a few. There's probably at least 20 endemic species of loricarids. Okay, so this is a quote from a paper that was published by a Brazilian geographer who was discussing the issue of dams in the Amazon. And it's a quote from someone he interviewed. That person said, "God only makes a place like the Xingu once." And after what I've told you, you're probably thinking this person appreciated natural history, right? The uniqueness of this place. But he said, this place was built for a dam. It's perfect for a dam. The potential, the hydro potential that exists in this region with these rapids and the kinetic energy available for capture to produce electricity is perfect. So they built the dam. This was a controversial project. Some of you may have heard about it. It's been controversial for like 35 years. If you remember when the rock star Sting was in the news, he was going down to Brazil and hanging out with indigenous groups and protesting. This is what they were protesting. But it got built. That's a long story we don't have time for. And so what it did, this is actual imagery, aerial imagery. So that's the before, and this is the after. And what you may notice is, let's see if this works. So this whole area is dewatered partially to varying degrees, depending on the flow and what they let out of the dam. And this was the richest rapids complex region on the river. That's where the zebra plicos live. So they've dewatered that big loop, and then they've flooded the upper parts. All the rapids that were there are now reservoir. And these fish that are adapted for this particular kind of habitat don't live in reservoirs. And so we've eliminated a great deal of habitat, and we've altered the hydrology of this reach of the river. And it's actually crazy because they built this dam here to make this reservoir so that they could send water through this canal that they constructed here and create this other reservoir, which was dry land before, so they just flooded forest there. And then the main powerhouse, I don't know if you can see this, where the red dot is, it's right there. So when the water goes back to the river downstream, that's where they're generating most of the hydropower. It's a crazy design. I'm like, if you really wanted to mess this river up in the best way that you could, you'd probably come up with something like that, right? Okay, so this is a quote from my colleague. He was a member of we had a big research team, lots of Brazilians, and people from the US and Canada were involved in this. This should be its own argument for its preservation, and yet they went ahead with the project. So in our work, we got in there before the dam was completed to get a before image of how the ecology of the river worked and to catch as many species as possible. Most of the people in our group were taxonomists, so they just wanted to describe the diversity in case some of it was going to be lost, just to know that what we had there. And we were studying the ecology. And we worked with the local collectors, the commercial ornamental fish collectors. These guys were really good at they would go down into the rapids and catch these fish by hand. I don't know how they did it. And then, like I said, a lot of the focus was taxonomy. So they're taking tissue samples for genetics analyses later on. That's my student Dan Fitzgerald in the front there. And just quickly, one of the things that Dan and I found is that there is a zonation in the river. You find different species, and many of the most endemic species in that region of the rapids where it's being impacted by the dam now. And then you've got other species in the lower part where it gives way to a deeper, wider, slower flowing river. And then you've got some species that can move back and forth through all of it. So that's the team that we had out there on one of the expeditions. And you may be wondering, what can we do in the future to mitigate these impacts? And people are trying as hard as they can to come up with ideas. It's not easy, because it appears they're going to continue to build some of these hydroelectric dams no matter what. One thing we are proposing is, let's take a good look at the distribution of species. Where are the endemic species? Where's the unique biodiversity? And let's make sure we protect those subbasins. And let's make sure that we don't cut off the lower reaches of the main stems so that we impact huge areas of the basin. So let's be strategic in dam placement. If we have to build them, if we need that energy, let's be smart about it. And let's think about this a priori, not after the project's already been approved. Also, there's alternative energy to hydropower. The public's being sold on the idea that hydropower is cheap and clean with low impact, environmental impact. It's not true. It's actually quite a dirty energy source. A lot of carbon is released into the atmosphere when you build a new reservoir. There's a lot of especially in the tropics, there's a lot of decomposing vegetation that's adding carbon to the atmosphere. So it's not free of pollution. And I talked about all the other impacts already, or many of them. So I'm going to end there. That's probably enough for everybody for one evening. And if we have time, if y'all want to stick around, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Yes? I know there's got to be at least one question.
Okay. Yes.
Kirk, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. Your notion about being strategic about hydro and putting the dams in strategic locations, how easy is that? Because oftentimes, as one of your quotes said,
The perfect
that
spot.
the spot was created by God to make hydro. So usually hydropower locations are on natural features that are ideal.
Exactly. So hydrologists are very good at mapping out the hydro potential on the landscape. They know how to do that. And they usually choose the most profitable places. But those are often sometimes the most impactful places, like Belamonte. That's like the worst spot I can think of on the river to do that. They could have moved a little further upstream, perhaps, or into a tributary, and there'd be a trade-off, right? So there would surely be trade-offs involved if we sit down and assess and look at the map. Where's the hydro potential? How much is here? How much is there? Where's the unique biodiversity? Where are the unique ecosystem services that are irreplaceable? And let's map that out, and let's put those maps side by side, and then let's start to have this assessment. But that's never been done as far as I know. I don't even know if they did that in North America when we built all the dams. Back in the 50s and 60s is when a lot of them were built. But that's what we need to do, because some of this biodiversity is very endemic. I mean, the Amazon's a big basin, but it's very heterogeneous, the way that the biodiversity is distributed in that big basin. So the fish aren't everywhere. There's pockets of unique biodiversity. So we're advocating that people start to do this before you go too far down the road of approving a project. And the way it goes now currently, from what I understand, everything I've been told, is a lot of impact assessments are carried out after the projects are already approved. Well, what good does that do? They're just going through the motions. It's just they're playing a silly game. So it's a political thing, you know, like a lot of things.
Okay, I'm going to let you ask one more question.
I'll flip the coin on that. Is there focus on dam removals in South America?
In South America, I don't think so, because they're in the building mode in South America. So we're in the dam removal mode here. We would hope they would learn from our mistakes, right? But again, the big problem is the political thing. But quite frankly, I mean, there's corruption in a lot of cases. There was a study done by a group of academics in England that studied the cost, the economics of major hydro projects in recent years. And they concluded that most of these projects never pay for themselves. There's the promise of economic development, and there's investments made, a lot of public money, oftentimes, and then that promise is not realized. And they have these budget shortfalls in the end that somebody gets left holding the bag, right? And that somebody is the public.
Well, I can't imagine that the sedimentation rates must be so high there. I can't imagine that any of these dams, especially in the Amazon, would have a very long expected life. I mean, I would guess it'd be like 10 years or something like that. You know?
Yeah, that's another thing. You know, dams have a certain lifespan, and it depends on the sediment dynamics. But yeah, those Andean rivers carry huge sediment loads. So yeah, I'm not an expert on that aspect of it, but I think you're right. I imagine it must be really high.
One more?
Last one.
So if even state himself can't stop these things from happening, what can, really? I mean, that's kind of what I always ask myself, because it's like, short of like eco-terrorism or something, how do you, you're right, you're combating corruption, you're combating ignorance. It's just, in many ways, it seems overwhelming.
Well, the Belo Monte project got stopped several times. Actually, my colleague Mark Sabay compiled a timeline of the Belo Monte project, and it goes way back, you know, decades. And there were periods when it was halted in the courts, and people thought the project was dead, and then it always came back again. And a lot of that had to do with the changing political parties, and yeah, it's just it's a sad story. It's all about politics.
Okay, on that depressing note.
Sorry.
So we're not done with questions because we're going to be here for a little while. We have some snacks down here for everyone to come down and talk to her. And then we'll probably head over to the Dread House for a drink as well. As soon as we eat all of this food.
Please eat it. I want some away.
But I wanted to thank Kurt on behalf of the Canadian Rivers Institute and the University of New Brunswick, on behalf of all of us, because that was one of the most entertaining and informative and wildly exciting, if you're a fish person, talks that we've ever had at Heinz Lecture. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thanks.